our planet Earth. A world of mystery and imagination, science and wonder, that is constantly being gazed upon and unraveled by the finest minds humanity has to offer. Welcome to the Univi Podcast, the show that presents a free-flowing conversation with those beings at the very center of the world of academia and research from all around the globe, with your host, Simon-Holland.
Hello and welcome to the show. Our guest today is Professor Andrew Derocher. He is a professor of biology at the University of Alberta and a long-time scientific advisor to the PBI. He holds a BS from the University of British Columbia, an MS from the University of Alberta, and a PhD from the University of Alberta. His field research focuses on polar bears in the Canadian Arctic and the polar bears of Hudson Bay. He has also worked with polar bears in Svalbard, Norway, through the Norwegian Polar Institute. Over the course of more than 20 years studying polar bears, Dr. Derocher's research is focused on limiting and regulating factors of polar bear populations, including habitat use, harvest effects, and predator-prey relationships. His current work includes assessment of the effects of climate change and toxic chemicals on polar bears. He is the author of Polar Bears, A Complete Guide to Their Biology and Behavior. Welcome to the show, Andrew Derocher. What is it about polar bears that kind of got you started?
Well, I actually was born in Vancouver, British Columbia. So I was a kid that grew up in the coast and the rainforest. And I don't think I had any sights on ever studying polar bears. I mean, I was working on grizzly bears when somebody suggested they knew somebody that worked on polar bears. Would I be interested? And that certainly sounded intriguing. And next thing I know, I was studying polar bears, and I kind of have the feeling almost like polar bears chose me as much as anything else. I could have studied anything in the natural world. I have diverse interests in ecosystems and different species. For some reason, polar bears and I just clicked. I'm really good at studying them, and they are a fascinating species to be able to spend time with and to write and think about.
In preparation, we're going to bed last night. I listened to a podcast from National Geographic with Jane Goodall, the primatologist who worked with chimpanzees and gorillas and the rest of it. And she sort of said how she got into it. She kind of wandered in and immersed herself. They got used to her and they yelled at her at the start and kind of warmed to her, and then she could study them from within. You can't really do that, can you?
Not if you want to do it for more than a little while. When you're talking about polar bears, I mean, you're always keeping one eye over your shoulder. They've got millions of years of expertise at sneaking around, trying to find things to kill and eat. And out on the sea ice where we do a lot of our work, I mean, we're just another potential meal ticket for them. And so in that respect, they are really not easy to study. They're usually far away from where people live. So we're quite often out in their habitat by helicopter, which means it's expensive as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of gain small glimpses of pieces of their life history and ecology as we're out there doing our research. So it's a challenging species, and it's one that if you went to parts of the range right now, you'd be hard pressed to even see them because it's still 24 hours of darkness at the very high reaches in the Arctic. So it's a tough place to be. And it's odd. I don't actually like being cold, so it's
no.
odd choice for me in that respect as well.
Yeah. Do you look at their adaptations? You just kind of get a little jealous.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, if you actually see what they ate for dinner, it's not something that I'd be that jazzed about. Probably most people wouldn't either. I mean, we think about polar bears as sort of being the largest terrestrial carnivore. Well, it's wrong on two fronts when you use that terminology. First of all, they're not really a terrestrial species at all. They're really more of a marine mammal. And then the other one is carna. If you actually translate it as carnivore, well, carna means meat, and they actually don't eat very much meat. What makes a polar bear tick is eating fat. So when they kill seals, mainly ringed and bearded seals, it's that fat that really makes it possible for the bears to be bears in a place where it's so incredibly cold. So the way I often describe polar bears is think of them more as a fat vacuum that goes around the Arctic, catching seals, sucking the fat, putting it in their own fat cells, and that's how they make a living.
So it's like a polar bear fight club.
It is totally. And, when you get down to it, it's incredibly successful way to be. And if you look at people that live in really cold climates, of course, they do gravitate to high fat diets because you just need the energy to be able to maintain normal body temperature and processes when it's that cold.
So your expeditions, they must be, I guess, relatively seasonal because there's hibernation. If you look at the documentary David Attenborough's Planet Earth, and I think everyone who's into this kind of stuff must have seen this documentary. The first episode's called Pole to Pole, and they really kick off with polar bears emerging from hibernation. The little ones rolling down the hill and cleaning their fur. And is that what it looks like when you first get out there for the polar bear season?
Well, it depends on what projects we're doing at any given time. And one of the things, natural history films always give you that nice sort of insight. One thing about polar bears is it's only the pregnant females that go into dens and overwinter. All the other bears, they're incredibly tough, and they're out there right through the dead of winter, walking around trying to find something to eat. So there is a lot of seasonality to our work. We usually want to be out doing our work when females with small cubs have emerged. Some populations in Canada will just be coming out of their dens with cubs. I would say in about 2 weeks from now, they'll be starting to trickle out. At higher latitudes, they'll be a month from coming out onto the sea ice. Um, so we're out there typically in the springtime, sometimes in the fall, depending on the population. Some of the populations, of course, spend the summer on land. Some of them spend the summer out on the sea ice. So it depends on where we are. It's always sort of depending on the question that we're asking at any given time. And a lot of our research right now is focused on trying to understand polar bears relative to their sea ice habitat and what the loss of that habitat will mean for them in the future.
I guess that's something that particularly a reason we wanted to speak to you. Kind of almost by accident, our first three episodes have been with biologists. We started with John Hutchinson, who's a biomechanist and studies dinosaur locomotion. Alex Greenwood works with ancient DNA and woolly mammoths. And I guess talking to you now really bookends looking is an indication of the future. And you're looking at potentially how the world's working, where it's going, not the extinctions from the past, but the extinctions possibly from the future. Is that something that you feel when you're looking at a climate so sensitive to climate change?
Yeah, it is. It definitely is an issue. And, when I first got involved in polar bears and sort of large mammal ecology, I never expected that, number one, that the planet would be changing as fast as it currently is. And even once I started to sort of gather that climate change was an issue back in the 1980s, it seemed like a very distant problem. And the first paper that I wrote with a co-author Ian Sterling back in 1993 that addressed polar bears in a warming climate, we sort of examined what the future might hold for polar bears should the climate be warming, and it was kind of a very far away idea. And now, of course, as we move ahead a few decades here, we're looking at a planet and a habitat in particular in the Arctic that is changing at a phenomenal rate. And the simplest way to understand the threat to polar bears going forward is it's no different than the risk that most species at risk face, and that is it's just a habitat loss issue. When you look at the distribution of polar bears, it's been dynamic over long periods of time. If we go back 10,000 years, we used to have polar bears down around Denmark and southern Sweden. Of course, that was a cold period. It was an ice age, and the ice was very far south. And then as the climate warmed, the bears went back north. The problem is now we've got this directional warming that just keeps taking away more and more sea ice every year. And so the challenge is how many more years do the bears have? In that context, as a conservation biologist, we tend to work with what we call a 3-generation rule. It's kind of an international standard for assessing the threat to a species. And for polar bears, that puts us into a time frame of 36 to about 45 years into the future. And what does that look like for polar bears? Well, we rely on sea ice scientists and climatologists to give us their best estimates of what the world will look like. And based on those estimates, it's pretty clear that we're going to lose at least half of the polar bears that we currently have. And we're going to see a massive retraction in their distribution that will probably really only have viable populations in the very high reaches of the Arctic and northern parts of Greenland, for example.
And by viable, do you mean sustainable for polar bears themselves?
Yeah, exactly. So a long-term viable population, one that has enough breeding individuals to reduce the likelihood of sort of these random events that occur in very small populations. Of course, that's predicated on us doing our part in terms of controlling greenhouse gases going forward. If we kind of follow the business as usual model that we're currently on, it gets considerably worse than that. The future looks pretty grim for a lot of Arctic species, and polar bears would just be one of the species that would likely blink out if we don't change our ways to some extent, anyways.
I think the conversation with climate change, I mean, this isn't obviously there's 7 billion people and this isn't a global conversation everybody's have, but we must know that it's happening by this point and we can show that it's happening. I guess getting the information out there is a completely different kettle of fish from knowing that it's happening. But I think what a lot of people, just like you were saying before, a lot of people didn't realize it was happening so fast. And I guess you're in the prime position to actually see just how fast it is. What do you feel that people need to know to be able to, how fast do we need to put a plan into action?
Well, I'm just a kind of a lowly polar bear biologist, and I've studied the bears, and I think they have given us a pretty clear signal of what the future holds for the bears. And the way I always come down to it is I'm not really an advocate for polar bears per se. I'm an advocate for people understanding the science about polar bears and what do we understand about this species and what the future looks like for polar bears going forward in time. So, in that respect, it's pretty clear that it's a societal issue whether people really want to buy, big gas burning trucks, live in big houses, and keep flying to all the vacations and using carbon resources as we currently are, or would they rather pull back the throttle a little bit and say, look, we need to be smarter about how we're living on this planet. And ultimately, it does, as you mentioned, comes down to how many people can we really sustain on this planet going forward. And currently, with our high carbon lifestyles, it certainly we're beyond the sustainable limit at this time, from what I can see. But I really try to stay to the polar bear science and what the climate scientists are telling us, and that, I think, is a pretty worrisome future for generations down the road. And one of the things I always tell my students when I'm lecturing about climate change in the context is, I'm going to be fertilizer by the time the real impact of climate change come to the fore. And at that stage, we're not going to be worried about, trying to keep viable populations of polar bears alive, although we could do that. What we're really going to be worried about is sort of the societal consequences of food and water and mass migration of humans across this planet. It has the potential to be quite disruptive. And I think the issues surrounding polar bears at that stage are probably going to be diminishing quite rapidly. We just won't have the resources to go out and perhaps feed polar bears in the wild to ensure that we have some there. We won't have the ability to do that, would be my expectation.
Now, you're doing pretty good on social media, doing a pretty good job on social media. You have quite a fun Twitter feed to follow that I've been following for a little while now. And yeah, you have you put up some really good stuff about the polar bear, such as there was a map of sea ice and you had which path takes less energy. And there was one that was just sort of crossing the sea ice and then one where the bear had to deviate, swim a bit and sort of took a roundabout way to get where they needed to go. It was like, which one uses more energy or something like that. I think you're creating something that has potential that people can, very shareable, very interactive, especially on social media. Is that a conscious kind of thing?
It is. And sometimes I guess there's, polar bears have been the target of the climate change deniers, partly because the story is so easy to understand. And the understanding of polar bear ecology and how they live in their environment is so well founded. We have had international research programs in the circumpolar Arctic for decades now. We really know these well. And so that made polar bears a target for a lot of the denier groups, some politicians in the United States, some what I would call pseudoscientists that like to sort of take random tilts at polar bear biology and polar bear biologists. And so some of those graphics are sometimes just a small sort of element of frustration from the deniers. And I just think, look, this is how simple it really is. It's not complicated, folks. And that's why, I was at a grade 1 class just a couple of weeks ago giving a talk to a bunch of little kids, and they understand it. They get